Sometimes the people we've left behind carry the most important pieces of our hearts. Marcus Caldwell was about to learn this painful lesson in the most public way possible. At 52, the tech millionaire had built an empire and was marrying the woman he believed completed his perfect image. But when he invited his ex-wife Elise to his lavish wedding, perhaps out of vanity, he expected her to decline. Instead, she arrived radiant with their twin daughters, children he'd barely seen since the divorce. The crowd fell silent. His bride hesitated, and Marcus found himself face to face with the life he'd abandoned for success. What happens when a man who has everything realizes he truly gave up what mattered most? Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story truly touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The California morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Marcus Caldwell's Malibu estate, each ray illuminating another testament to his extraordinary success. From his bedroom window on the third floor, he could see the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon, its blue expanse broken only by the occasional yacht belonging to his neighbors, fellow titans of technology and entertainment, who had made these coastal cliffs their kingdom. Today was supposed to be perfect. After 2 years of courtship, Marcus was finally marrying Victoria Sterling, a woman who represented everything he believed he deserved after clawing his way up from nothing. At 28, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that graced magazine covers and charity galas. Her blonde hair, always perfectly styled, her wardrobe a careful curation of designer pieces that never seemed ostentatious yet whispered wealth to those who knew how to listen. Victoria emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a silk robe, her hair already styled by the team of professionals who had arrived at dawn. The wedding planner, a severe woman named Patricia Hoffman, who commanded 5-figure fees for her services, had been bustling around the estate since sunrise, directing an army of florists, caterers, and photographers with military precision. "The flowers look spectacular," Victoria said, moving to stand beside Marcus at the window. Below them, white roses and peonies created elegant arrangements throughout the garden where 200 of their closest friends and business associates would soon gather. Patricia outdid herself. Marcus nodded, but his attention drifted to his study across the hallway, where a small, weathered dollar bill hung in an expensive gold frame above his desk. It was the first dollar he had ever earned, payment for fixing a neighbor's computer when he was 16 years old. Back then, living in a cramped apartment in Oakland with his mother, that single dollar had felt like a fortune. Now, surrounded by art worth more than most people's homes, it served as a reminder of how far he had traveled from those humble beginnings. The irony wasn't lost on him that the invitation list for today's wedding contained none of the people who had known him. Then, his mother would be there, of course, flying in from the comfortable retirement home he had purchased for her in Florida. But the friends from his old neighborhood, the teachers who had believed in him, the community that had shaped his character, they belonged to a different Marcus, one he had carefully shed like an uncomfortable skin. "I should check on the catering setup," Victoria said, kissing his cheek with the practiced affection of someone who understood their relationship as much as a partnership as a romance. She had been raised in the world Marcus had fought to enter, the daughter of a banking dynasty whose wealth traced back generations. Her ease with luxury, her instinctive understanding of social hierarchies, and her ability to navigate the complex politics of high society had been as attractive to him as her physical beauty. Marcus watched her glide from the room with the graceful confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. In many ways, Victoria was perfect for him, intelligent without being challenging, beautiful without being vain, connected without being demanding. She complemented his success story beautifully, the kind of wife who would enhance his image at board meetings and charity events. Yet as he prepared for what should have been the happiest day of his life, Marcus found his thoughts drifting to places he had trained himself not to go. The framed dollar bill seemed to mock him, reminding him of the young man who had dreamed not just of wealth, but of building something meaningful, something that would last beyond quarterly reports and stock valuations. His phone buzzed with a text from his best man, David Chen, a fellow entrepreneur who had made his fortune in renewable energy. Getting ready to head over. You nervous? The message read. Marcus typed back a quick, ready as I'll ever be, but the words felt hollow even as he sent them. Truth was more complicated. Marcus had built Caldwell Technologies from nothing, turning a simple idea about data compression into a company that now employed over 3,000 people and had made him worth more than $500 million. The journey had required sacrifices, late nights that turned into early mornings, weekends consumed by work, relationships strained by his single-minded pursuit of success. Some sacrifices had been easier to bear than others. The friends who couldn't understand his ambition had fallen away naturally. The social activities that didn't advance his goals had been easy to eliminate. But other losses cut deeper, creating wounds that success had never quite healed. He thought about Elise, though he tried not to let her memory intrude on days like today. They had met in college, both scholarship students trying to make their way in a world that hadn't been designed for people like them. She had been studying art education, passionate about bringing creativity to underserved communities, while he had been consumed with computer science and dreams of technological revolution. For a while, their dreams had seemed compatible. They had married young, living in a tiny apartment while he worked on his first startup and she taught at an inner-city elementary school. She had believed in him when venture capitalists wouldn't return his calls, had celebrated his small victories as if they were her own, had never complained about the ramen dinners and second-hand furniture that comprised their early life together, even after Caldwell Technologies began to take off, even after they moved to a better apartment and then a small house in the suburbs. Elise had remained grounded in the things that mattered beyond money. She had continued teaching, had talked about starting a family, had assumed that success would give them more time together, not less. Marcus pushed these thoughts aside as he dressed in his custom-tailored tuxedo, focusing instead on the day ahead. The guest list read like a who's who of California's elite, tech moguls, entertainment executives, politicians and socialites, whose presence at his wedding served as validation of his arrival in their exclusive circle. These were relationships built on mutual benefit rather than affection, but they were the relationships that mattered in his world now. Victoria reappeared in the doorway, now dressed in her wedding gown, a stunning creation of silk and lace that had been featured in 3 different bridal magazines. She looked every inch the perfect bride, radiant and confident, ready to assume her role as Mrs. Marcus Caldwell. The photographer wants to get some shots of you getting ready, she said, and Patricia needs to confirm the timeline for the ceremony. Marcus nodded, slipping his watch onto his wrist, a vintage Patek Philippe that had cost more than his mother's annual income. Everything about today was perfect, carefully orchestrated to project success, happiness, and social triumph. The setting was flawless, the bride was radiant, the guest list was impressive. So why did he feel like he was preparing for a performance rather than a celebration? The answer came to him as he caught sight of that framed dollar bill one more time. The young man who had earned that dollar had been driven by more than the desire for wealth. He had wanted to build something meaningful, to prove that someone, from his background, could succeed without losing his soul in the process. That young man had fallen in love with an art teacher who saw the world in terms of beauty and possibility rather than profit margins and market share. But that young man was gone now, replaced by someone who measured success in stock prices and social position. Someone who had learned to view relationships through the lens of strategic advantage. It was a transformation that had brought him everything he thought he wanted, But as he prepared to marry a woman who represented the pinnacle of his social climbing, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something essential along the way. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the estate as final preparations continued below. In a few hours, he would stand before 200 carefully selected witnesses and marry Victoria Sterling, cementing his place in the upper echelons of society. It would be a perfect day, photographed and documented, a celebration that would be talked about in social circles for months to come. Yet as Marcus straightened his tie and prepared to join the festivities, his eyes kept returning to that weathered dollar bill, a reminder of dreams and values that seemed as distant now as the Oakland apartment where they had been born. The wedding ceremony unfolded with the precision Patricia Hoffman was famous for. White chairs arranged in perfect rows faced an altar decorated with cascading arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. The string quartet played softly as guests settled into their seats, a carefully curated collection of California's most influential figures dressed in their finest attire. Marcus stood at the altar beside the officiant, a dignified man who performed ceremonies for the wealthy and famous. David Chen stood to his left as best man, occasionally offering reassuring nods as they waited for the processional to begin. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, the kind of magical illumination that wedding photographers cherished, and that would make the pictures perfect for the society pages. From his position at the altar, Marcus could survey the assembled crowd. Victoria's family occupied the front rows on the right side. Her parents, Richard and Catherine Sterling, represented old money elegance, their posture perfect, their expressions pleasantly neutral. Her bridesmaids, all from similar backgrounds, had been chosen as much for their social connections as their friendship with the bride. His side of the wedding was a different story. His mother sat in the front row, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the grandeur, but radiating pride in her son's accomplishments. Behind her, rows of business associates, investors, and industry colleagues filled the seats, relationships built on mutual benefit rather than personal affection, but impressive nonetheless. The music shifted, signaling the beginning of the processional. Victoria's bridesmaids began their walk down the aisle, each step perfectly timed to the melody. Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, probably another business call that he would have to ignore, a habit that had become second nature. Over the years, as the bridesmaids took their positions, Marcus found himself scanning the back rows of the ceremony, a nervous habit he hadn't expected. Part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, was looking for someone who wouldn't be there. 3 weeks ago, in a moment of what he could only describe as temporary insanity, he had sent an invitation to his ex-wife. The decision had seemed logical at the time, even magnanimous. Elise had been part of his past, and successful people didn't hide from their history. Besides, he knew she wouldn't come. The invitation had been postmarked to her small apartment in Oakland, a world away from this Malibu estate, both geographically and socially. It had been a gesture, nothing more, perhaps even a subtle demonstration of how far he had risen from their shared beginning. In his study upstairs, locked away in a safe behind a painting worth more than most people's cars, were the divorce papers that had legally ended their marriage 5 years ago. He had kept them, though he couldn't say why, perhaps as a reminder of what happened when sentiment interfered with ambition. The papers had turned yellow at the edges, but the terms were still clear: joint custody of their twin daughters, though Elise would have primary residence, and a financial settlement that had seemed generous at the time, but now felt almost insulting. Given his current wealth, the music swelled, indicating Victoria's entrance. Marcus turned his attention to the back of the aisle, where his bride would soon appear in all her radiant glory. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the culmination of 2 years of courtship and months of wedding planning. But instead of Victoria, he saw a commotion near the entrance to the ceremony space. Guests were turning in their seats, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Marcus squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to understand what was causing the disturbance. Then he saw her. Elise walked through the garden gates with quiet confidence, her hand gently holding those of two small girls, Maya and Grace, his daughters, now 5 years old and looking like miniature versions of their mother. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress that complemented her natural beauty without trying to compete with the opulence surrounding her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a classic style, and she moved with the same graceful composure that had first attracted him in college. The whispers grew louder as guests recognized the significance of the arrival. Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis as he watched Elise guide their daughters towards seats in the back section. The girls looked around with wide eyes, taking in the grandeur of the estate with the innocent wonder of children seeing something magical for the first time. David leaned close to Marcus's ear. "Isn't that—" he began, but Marcus cut him off with a barely perceptible shake of his head. His heart was pounding so loudly he was certain the front row could hear it. Maya and Grace had grown so much since he had last seen them. When was it? 3 months ago? 4? The realization hit him like a physical blow. His own daughters. And he couldn't remember the last time they had spent meaningful time together. They looked healthy and happy, their faces bright with curiosity as they settled into their seats beside their mother. The music continued, but the ceremony had lost its rhythm. Guests continued to steal glances toward the back where Elise sat, their expressions ranging from surprise to concern to barely concealed delight at the unexpected drama. Victoria's parents looked positively scandalized, while Richard Sterling's face had taken on a distinctly stormy expression. Marcus tried to focus on the altar, on the officiant who was looking increasingly uncomfortable, on anything other than the fact that his past had just walked into his carefully constructed present. But his eyes kept drifting to where Elise sat, her attention focused on keeping the twins comfortable rather than on the spectacle surrounding them. The music reached its crescendo, and Victoria finally appeared at the back of the aisle. She looked spectacular in her designer gown, every inch the perfect bride. But as she began her walk toward the altar, Marcus saw her notice the disturbance in the crowd, saw her eyes find Elise and the children, saw her perfect composure falter for just a moment. The processional felt endless. Victoria's steps seemed to slow as she processed not just down the aisle, but also what this unexpected arrival meant. Her smile remained fixed, but Marcus knew her well enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes. When she finally reached the altar, Victoria took her place beside Marcus with practiced grace, but her whispered, "What is she doing here?" carried more venom than anyone but Marcus could hear. The officiant, a professional who had handled his share of society weddings and their accompanying drama, cleared his throat and began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But his words seemed to fade into background noise as Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on anything other than the fact that his daughters were here, watching him marry another woman. He stole another glance toward the back of the ceremony. Elise had settled Maya and Grace on either side of her, producing small coloring books and crayons from her purse to keep them occupied during the adult proceedings. The simple gesture of maternal preparation struck him as profoundly thoughtful. She had come to his wedding, but had also ensured her children would be comfortable and entertained. The officiant continued with the traditional words, but Marcus felt as though he were hearing them from underwater. The assembled guests, the beautiful setting, the expensive flowers, everything that had seemed so important an hour ago, now felt like an elaborate stage set for a play he no longer wanted to perform in. Victoria's hand found his, her grip tighter than necessary, and he realized the officiant was asking him a question, something about taking Victoria as his lawfully wedded wife, about sickness and health, about better or worse. Standard wedding vows that suddenly felt loaded with meaning he hadn't considered before. As he opened his mouth to respond, his eyes met Elise's across the crowd of guests. She wasn't looking at him with anger or bitterness, but with something far more unsettling, a calm, almost sad understanding that made him feel as though she could see straight through the successful facade to the man he used to be. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and Marcus became aware that everyone was waiting for his answer, that his hesitation was becoming noticeable to the assembled crowd. Victoria's grip on his hand tightened further, and he could feel David's concerned presence beside him. But all Marcus could think about was those yellow divorce papers in his safe, and how final they had seemed when he signed them 5 years ago, and how absolutely nothing about this moment felt final at all. "I do." The words escaped Marcus's lips almost without his conscious decision, pulled from him by years of social conditioning and the weight of 200 expectant gazes. Victoria's relieved smile was radiant as she repeated her own vows, her voice clear and confident, despite the unexpected drama that had preceded this moment. The ceremony continued with mechanical precision, but Marcus felt detached from his own wedding, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife and invited him to kiss the bride, Marcus leaned forward and performed the gesture with all the passion of a business handshake. The crowd erupted in polite applause, but the sound seemed muffled and distant. As they walked back down the aisle together, Victoria's arm linked through his. Marcus couldn't help but notice how the guests' attention was divided. Some smiled and applauded the newly married couple, but others were still stealing glances toward where Elise sat with Maya and Grace. His daughters were busy with their coloring books, Maya carefully staying within the lines of what appeared to be a family scene, while Grace took a more abstract approach with bold strokes of purple and green. The sight of his children creating art struck him with unexpected force. He remembered Elise talking about the importance of creativity in child development, how she believed every child was an artist until the world taught them otherwise. It was the kind of conversation they used to have in their tiny apartment. When Elise would come home from teaching and share stories about her students while Marcus worked on his laptop, only half listening as he chased the next breakthrough that would make his fortune. The receiving line was a blur of congratulations and air kisses from people whose names Marcus knew from business cards and society pages rather than genuine friendship. Victoria played her part perfectly, gracious and elegant, but he could feel the tension in her posture, the slight edge to her smile that suggested she was performing despite her best efforts to appear natural. David Chen approached with a concerned expression, pulling Marcus aside as the formal photos began. "That was interesting," he said carefully. "Want to talk about it?" "Nothing to talk about," Marcus replied, but even he could hear how unconvincing he sounded. "Elise and I have joint custody. She has every right to attend significant events. In my life, right," David said slowly. "Except you didn't expect her to actually show up." Marcus didn't answer because David was absolutely right. The invitation had been a gesture, a way of proving to himself that he had moved beyond their failed marriage. In his mind, Elise belonged to his past, a chapter he had closed when he signed those divorce papers 5 years ago. The papers had been simple and straightforward. Irreconcilable differences, joint custody arrangements, financial settlements, clean and final, or so he had thought. But watching Elise patiently help Grace find the right colored crayon in her little box, Marcus remembered the conversation that had led to those papers. They had been sitting in their kitchen, not the gleaming, magazine-worthy kitchen of his current estate, but the modest space in their suburban home where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations. "You're never here anymore," Elise had said, her voice weary rather than angry. "Even when you're physically present, you're thinking about the company, planning the next expansion, checking your phone. Maya asked me yesterday why Daddy doesn't play with them anymore." He had tried to explain about the pressures of building a business, about the sacrifices necessary for success, about how everything he was doing was for their family's future. But even as he spoke the words, he had known they sounded hollow. The truth was that the chase had become more intoxicating than the destination, that each new level of success only revealed another mountain to climb. "I need a partner," Elise had continued. "The girls need a father who's present, not just a provider. And I think you need to figure out who you want to be before you can be that person for us." The divorce had been amicable, at least on paper. They had attended mediation sessions, divided assets, arranged custody schedules. Marcus had written checks for child support with the same efficiency he brought to all his business transactions, convinced that his financial contributions were a reasonable substitute for his emotional presence. Now, watching Maya carefully, add details to her drawing, what appeared to be a house with 3 stick figures in front of it, notably missing a 4th, Marcus felt the full weight of what those clinical divorce proceedings had actually meant. He had legally extracted himself from daily responsibility for his daughters' lives, turning fatherhood into a series of scheduled visits and financial obligations. The reception area had been transformed while they were taking photos. String lights twinkled overhead, creating a magical canopy above elegantly appointed tables. The catering staff moved with choreographed precision, serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres to guests who had transitioned from ceremony mode to party mode with the ease of people accustomed to high society events. Marcus noticed that Elise had found a table toward the back of the reception area, away from the main action, but with a clear view of the festivities. She had somehow produced juice, boxes and small snacks for the twins, another example of the thoughtful preparation that had always characterized her approach to parenting. Other guests were beginning to approach her table, drawn by curiosity or genuine warmth, and Marcus watched with growing unease as his ex-wife charmed people he had spent years trying to impress. Victoria appeared at his side, her smile bright, but her voice sharp with annoyance. "People are asking me about her," she said, nodding almost imperceptibly toward Elise's table. "What exactly am I supposed to tell them?" "Tell them she's the mother of my children," Marcus replied, though the words felt strange in his mouth. When had he started thinking of Elise in terms of her function rather than her identity? When had the mother of my children replaced my ex-wife or simply Elise in his mental vocabulary? "That's not exactly helpful," Victoria said. "Richard is asking questions about your judgment, and Catherine looks like she's planning my funeral. This was supposed to be our day, Marcus, our perfect day." Marcus looked around at the perfect reception, with its perfect decorations and perfect food being served to their perfectly curated guest list. Everything was exactly as they had planned, except for the presence of 3 people who represented a version of himself he had thought he had successfully left behind. But as he watched Maya show her completed drawing to another guest, a tech executive who knelt down to admire the child's work with genuine enthusiasm, Marcus realized that perfection might not be what he had been looking for after all. The reception moved into full swing as the sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon, casting the estate in warm golden hues that photographers would later describe as magical. Guests mingled freely among the elegant table settings, champagne flutes catching the light as conversations flowed with the easy rhythm of people accustomed to such gatherings. Marcus found himself gravitating toward the bar, not because he needed alcohol, but because it provided a strategic vantage point from which to observe the evening's unexpected dynamics. What he saw both fascinated and unsettled him. Rather than being intimidated by the wealth and social status surrounding her, Elise moved through the reception with quiet confidence, engaging with guests who approached her table with genuine warmth and intelligence. He watched as Robert Chen, David's father, and a prominent venture capitalist spent nearly 15 minutes in animated conversation with Elise. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to drift within earshot, He caught fragments of their discussion about arts education funding and the importance of creativity in developing problem-solving skills. Robert was nodding enthusiastically, clearly impressed by Elise's knowledge and passion. "Your ex-wife is quite remarkable," Robert said when he noticed Marcus nearby. "She's been telling me about her work at Roosevelt Elementary. Did you know she was named Teacher of the Year by the Oakland Unified School District? Not just for her school, for the entire district. That's over 100 schools, Marcus." Marcus felt a strange mix of pride and shame wash over him. He had not known about the award, had not even known it existed. In the years since their divorce, his knowledge of Elise's life had been limited to the logistics of child exchanges and the occasional glimpse of information gleaned from Maya and Grace during their visits. "She's always been dedicated to her work," Marcus replied, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. He remembered the modest plaque that had hung in their bedroom when they were married, some minor teaching recognition that he had barely acknowledged at the time. It seemed that Elise's commitment to education had only deepened in his absence. She mentioned a program she developed for integrating art therapy with traditional academic subjects, Robert continued. "Apparently, she's working with children who have experienced trauma, helping them process emotions through creative expression. The results, she described, were extraordinary. Significant improvements in both academic performance and emotional stability." As Robert moved on to greet other guests, Marcus remained by the bar, processing this information about the woman he had once shared his life with. The Elise he remembered had been passionate about teaching, certainly, but the person Robert described sounded like someone who had built something significant, something that mattered beyond financial metrics or social status. Across the reception area, Maya and Grace had finished their snacks and were exploring the garden under Elise's watchful eye. Grace had found a butterfly and was following it with intense concentration, while Maya had stopped to examine a flowering bush, her artist's eye clearly drawn to the colors and patterns. Other guests smiled as they watched the children, their presence adding an unexpected warmth to what might otherwise have been a rather formal affair. Victoria appeared beside Marcus, her champagne glass gripped tightly enough that her knuckles showed white. "She's quite the center of attention," she observed, her tone carefully neutral, but her meaning clear. "She's being polite to people who are approaching her," Marcus replied. "I didn't expect her to hide in the corner." "No, of course not," Victoria said quickly. "It's just that people seem very interested in her work, her life. Margaret Henderson spent 20 minutes talking to her about some arts program she wants to fund. Apparently your ex-wife is exactly the kind of educator she's been looking for." Margaret Henderson was one of California's most prominent philanthropists, known for her strategic approach to charitable giving and her ability to spot innovative programs before they gained widespread recognition. The fact that she was interested in Elise's work was significant, both professionally and socially. "That's good," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure why the news made him feel vaguely territorial. "Elise deserves recognition for what she does." "Of course she does," Victoria agreed, but her smile looked strained. "I just didn't expect her to be quite so charismatic. People seemed genuinely drawn to her." As if to illustrate Victoria's point, Marcus's mother appeared at Elise's table, and Marcus watched as his daughters lit up at the sight of their grandmother. Dorothy Caldwell had always adored Maya and Grace, but the distance between Florida and California meant their visits were infrequent. Now, watching his mother kneel down to embrace her granddaughters, Marcus felt another stab of guilt about the relationships his success had complicated. "Grandma Dot!" Grace exclaimed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, throwing her arms around Dorothy's neck with the uninhibited affection of a 5-year-old. Maya was more reserved but equally pleased, showing her grandmother the drawing she had completed during the ceremony. The reunion drew smiles from nearby guests, but Marcus noticed that Dorothy's expression was complex as she settled into a chair beside Elise. The two women had always gotten along well. Dorothy had supported Elise during the divorce, making it clear that she blamed her son's priorities rather than his wife for the marriage's failure. Marcus excused himself from Victoria and moved closer to his mother's table, ostensibly to greet his daughters, but really to gauge the dynamic between the three most important women in his life. As he approached, he caught the tail end of a conversation that made his stomach clench. "Missed her first day of kindergarten," Dorothy was saying to Elise, her voice carrying a note of reproach that was clearly intended for Marcus's ears. "I asked him about it when we talked last week, and he didn't even know they had started school." "They're adjusting well," Elise replied diplomatically. "Maya loves her art class, and Grace has made friends with a little boy who shares her fascination with insects." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized how much of his daughters' lives he had missed, how little he knew about their daily experiences, their challenges, their victories. The scheduled visits that had seemed adequate from a legal standpoint suddenly felt profoundly insufficient from a human one. "Daddy!" Grace noticed his approach and ran to hug his legs, her enthusiasm undiminished by his recent absence from her life. Maya followed more cautiously, but she smiled when he knelt down to their level. "How are my girls?" he asked, the question feeling both natural and foreign in his mouth. "Good," Maya replied. "We saw the ocean from the car. It's really big." "We brought you a present," Grace added, digging into a small backpack that Elise had brought. She pulled out a handmade card decorated with crayon flowers and glitter. "We made it at school." Marcus opened the card to find a drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands, 2 large, 2 small, standing in front of a house with a sun shining overhead. At the bottom, in Maya's careful printing, were the words, "Happy Wedding, Daddy." The simple gesture hit him harder than any of the expensive gifts he had received from business associates, harder than the congratulations from society figures whose approval he had sought for years. His daughters had made him a wedding present, despite not being invited to participate in the ceremony, despite being an afterthought in his new life. As he looked up from the card to thank them, Marcus found Elise watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not judgment, not resentment, but something that looked almost like hope. The cocktail hour stretched longer than planned as guests seemed reluctant to move toward their assigned dinner tables, drawn instead to the unexpected. Drama unfolding in their midst, Marcus found himself caught between his obligations as host and his growing compulsion to engage with the family he had legally left behind, but never emotionally resolved. Finally, clutching the handmade card from his daughters like a talisman, Marcus approached the table where Elise sat with Maya, Grace, and his mother. The simple act of walking those 30 yards felt monumental, as if he were crossing more than physical space, crossing years of careful emotional distance, crossing the boundaries he had constructed between his old life and his new one. "Thank you for the card," he said to his daughters, his voice softer than he had intended. "It's beautiful." Maya beamed with pride while Grace bounced in her chair. "We worked really hard on it," Maya said. "Grace wanted to make the sun purple, but I told her suns are yellow." "Purple suns would be pretty too," Marcus found himself saying, surprising himself with the gentle correction. In his business world, precision and conventional thinking were valued above creativity. But looking at Grace's disappointed expression, he realized that maybe some rules weren't worth enforcing. "Can we make a purple sun next time?" Grace asked hopefully. Next time. The words escaped before Marcus could consider their implications. When would there be a next time for art projects with his daughters? Their custody arrangement involved alternating weekends, but Marcus realized with shame that he couldn't remember the last time they had spent that scheduled time together without him checking emails or taking calls. Elise cleared her throat gently. "Girls, why don't you go with Grandma Dot to see the fountain? She was telling me about the fish." Dorothy stood with the practiced efficiency of a grandmother, taking each girl by the hand. "Come on, my darlings. Let's see if we can count all the goldfish." She gave Marcus a meaningful look as she led the twins away, clearly creating space for a conversation that was long overdue. For a moment, Marcus and Elise sat in silence, the sounds of the reception, laughter, clinking glasses, string quartet melodies, providing a backdrop to their reunion. Up close, Marcus could see the subtle changes that 5 years had brought to his ex-wife's face. There were small lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage, evidence of both laughter and worry. But there was also a quality he didn't remember, a centeredness, a quiet confidence that suggested she had found peace with her life choices. "You look well," he said finally, immediately regretting the banality of the observation. "Thank you." Elise's smile was polite but guarded. "So do you. Success suits you." The comment could have been interpreted as a compliment, but Marcus heard the subtle undertone, "Success suits you, but what about happiness? What about fulfillment beyond financial achievement?" "I didn't think you would come," Marcus admitted. "When I sent the invitation, you thought I would be too proud or too hurt to attend?" Elise's voice carried no accusation, just curiosity. "I thought you would be too busy," Marcus said, though they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. "With your work, with the girls. I know you have a full life." "I do have a full life," Elise agreed, "but Maya and Grace deserve to see their father get married. This is part of their history too, whether we like it or not." The simple statement carried more weight than any recrimination could have. Marcus realized that while he had viewed his wedding as a celebration of his new beginning, his daughters would remember it as the day Daddy married someone who wasn't Mommy. A milestone in their understanding of their fractured family structure. "How are they handling everything?" Marcus asked, gesturing vaguely toward the reception, toward the obvious display of wealth that surrounded them. "They're resilient," Elise replied. "Children adapt, but they ask questions I don't always know how to answer." Before Marcus could ask what kind of questions, his phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. The sound was louder than it should have been, cutting through their conversation like a physical intrusion. Marcus instinctively reached for the device, a Pavlovian response developed over years of conditioning himself to be available to investors, clients, and board members at all hours. The caller ID showed James Morrison, his company's chief financial officer. Marcus hesitated, his finger hovering over the decline button, but the conditioning was too strong. Morrison wouldn't call during his wedding unless it was urgent. "I'm sorry," Marcus said to Elise. "I need to take this." He saw something shift in her expression, not anger, but a weary recognition that was somehow worse than anger would have been. It was the look of someone who had lived this scene too many times before. "Marcus," Morrison's voice was tense even through the phone's speaker, "we've got a situation with the Singapore deal. Their board is demanding changes to the licensing terms, and they want an answer by Monday morning our time. I know it's your wedding day, but can't this wait until next week?" Marcus asked, but even as he spoke, he was already mentally shifting into business mode, calculating time zones and considering strategic responses. "Not if we want to keep them from walking away. They're already talking to our competitors. I've got the revised contract terms on my laptop if you want to conference call tonight." Marcus caught sight of Elise watching him, her expression carefully neutral, but her body language speaking volumes. She had straightened in her chair, creating psychological distance, even though she hadn't physically moved. Nearby guests were beginning to notice the business call happening in the middle of the wedding reception, their expressions ranging from understanding to mild disapproval. "Let me call you back in 20 minutes, Marcus said into the phone, ending the call before Morrison could respond. But the damage was already done. The moment of tentative reconnection between Marcus and Elise had been shattered by the insistent demands of his professional life, the same demands that had eroded their marriage one call, one email, one urgent crisis at a time. "Some things never change," Elise said quietly, and Marcus realized she wasn't just talking about his inability to ignore business calls. She was talking about his priorities, His instinct to put work ahead of personal relationships, his assumption that everything else could wait while he handled whatever crisis demanded his immediate attention. Across the reception area, Victoria was watching their interaction with growing concern. Marcus could see her making calculations, weighing the social implications of his extended conversation with his ex-wife against the awkwardness of interrupting them. Her solution, when it came, was elegant in its directness. Marcus, Victoria. He appeared at their table with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Patricia needs to speak with us about the dinner timeline. Apparently the caterers are ready to begin service. It was a perfectly reasonable interruption, the kind of wedding logistics that required the bride and groom's attention. But Marcus could see the territorial nature of Victoria's intervention, the way she positioned herself slightly between him and Elise. The subtle claim of ownership implicit in her request. He stood reluctantly, aware that he was choosing to attend to wedding logistics rather than continue the most meaningful conversation he had had in months. As he prepared to follow Victoria toward the catering manager, his phone buzzed again with another incoming call. The evening reception transitioned seamlessly from cocktails to dinner service, with guests moving toward their assigned tables as the California sun painted the estate in warm amber hues. Crystal stemware caught the light from dozens of strategically placed candles, while the gentle murmur of refined conversation created an atmosphere of understated elegance that wedding planners charge substantial fees to achieve. Marcus sat at the head table, mechanically responding to the congratulations and small talk from nearby guests, but his attention remained fixed on table 12, where his family, he caught himself using that word and felt a sharp pang of recognition, had settled into an easy rhythm that seemed to energize everyone around them. The contrast between the formal politeness at his table and the genuine warmth radiating from Elise's location was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As the first course was served, Marcus found himself thinking about a simple gold band that lay hidden in the bottom drawer of his home office desk, beneath insurance documents and old tax returns. The ring was unremarkable by current standards. A plain wedding band that had cost him 2 weeks' salary when he bought it 12 years ago, before Caldwell Technologies existed, before wealth became his primary pursuit, before he learned to measure success in stock valuations rather than shared moments. He had worn that ring for 7 years, through the early struggles of building his company, through sleepless nights spent coding while Elise graded papers beside him, through the first tentative celebrations of small business victories. The ring had been present for Maya and Grace's births, had reflected light during countless family dinners around their modest kitchen table, had been a constant reminder that his individual achievements were part of something larger and more meaningful. The decision to remove it had been clinical, part of the legal dissolution of their marriage 5 years ago. But instead of returning it to Elise or storing it with other mementos, Marcus had hidden it away like evidence of a crime he preferred not to remember. Sometimes, late at night when business pressures kept him awake, he would think about that, ring and wonder if keeping it made him sentimental or simply pathetic. David Chen rose from his seat, champagne glass raised, his presence commanding the attention of the assembled guests with the natural authority of someone accustomed to public speaking. The conversations quieted as 200 faces turned toward the head table, anticipating the traditional best man's toast. "I've had the privilege of knowing Marcus Caldwell for 15 years, David began, his voice carrying easily across the reception area. "When we first met, he was operating out of a cramped garage in Oakland, living on determination and whatever food cost less than $5 a meal. I remember thinking he was either completely brilliant or completely insane for believing he could revolutionize data compression technology from that tiny workspace. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd, guests enjoying the familiar narrative of entrepreneurial struggle leading to spectacular triumph. Marcus smiled appropriately, but his eyes drifted to table 12, where Elise listened with an expression he couldn't decipher. She had been there during those garage days, had believed in his vision when established investors dismissed him as naive, had celebrated each small breakthrough as if it were a major victory. Today, Caldwell Technologies stands as proof that brilliant usually wins over insane, David continued. The company employs over 3,000 people across 4 countries and has fundamentally changed how the world handles digital information. But more than his professional achievements, Marcus represents the best of American entrepreneurship. The idea that vision, combined with relentless work, can transform not just individual lives, but entire industries. The toast was generous and well-crafted, hitting all the expected notes about success and achievement. Marcus appreciated David's friendship and his public support, but the words felt disconnected from his current emotional state. Missing from the narrative was any mention of the personal costs of that relentless work, the relationships strained by single-minded focus, the family moments sacrificed for business opportunities. As David raised his glass higher, preparing for the traditional conclusion, Marcus caught sight of Maya sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. Elise had adjusted her position to better support their daughter's weight, and the gesture reminded Marcus powerfully of similar scenes from their marriage. Elise caring for their children with effortless devotion, while he remained absorbed in spreadsheets and strategic planning. To Marcus and Victoria, David concluded, may your partnership be as successful and enduring as everything else you've built together. The guests raised their glasses and drank to his success, but Marcus felt the toast's emphasis on achievement and building rather than loving and being present. It was a perfectly appropriate tribute to his professional accomplishments that somehow managed to miss everything that had once mattered most to him. Richard Sterling stood next, Victoria's father assuming the podium with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to commanding expensive audiences. His presence was imposing, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the quiet authority that came from generational wealth and social position. My daughter Victoria has always been discerning in her choices, Richard began, his slight pause carrying subtle weight. She has been courted by young men from some of America's finest families. Families with distinguished histories of public service, philanthropy, and cultural contribution. Marcus felt the temperature of the room shift slightly as guests recognized the subtext of Richard's opening remarks. This wasn't going to be a simple celebration of the bride and groom. It was going to be a carefully crafted assertion of social hierarchy disguised as paternal sentiment. But Victoria chose differently, Richard continued, his smile never wavering, even as his words carried unmistakable condescension. She chose to embrace change, to welcome someone whose background represents the entrepreneurial spirit that has always characterized American opportunity. It takes courage to look beyond traditional considerations of family history and social compatibility. The insults were delivered with such polished skill that some guests might have mistaken them for compliments, but Marcus heard every barb clearly. Richard Sterling was publicly acknowledging his daughter's marriage, while simultaneously establishing that it represented a charitable inclusion of an outsider into their exclusive world. Marriage, after all, is about more than matching pedigrees, Richard said, taking a sip of champagne before delivering his final observation. Sometimes love requires us to overlook differences in upbringing, education, and social understanding. Victoria has chosen to do exactly that. The toast concluded, with tepid applause that felt more like polite obligation than celebration. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, understanding that he had just been publicly evaluated and found acceptable but fundamentally inadequate, admitted to the club, but reminded that his membership was provisional and dependent on good behavior. Victoria's face had flushed during her father's speech, whether from embarrassment at his transparent snobbery or anger at his public undermining of her marriage. Marcus couldn't determine. But the damage was done. 200 influential guests had just witnessed his father-in-law's assessment of him as a social inferior, whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. As dinner service resumed and conversations gradually returned to normal volume, Marcus noticed that the social dynamics of the reception had evolved throughout the evening. While his table hosted the officially important guests, board members, investors, industry leaders, the authentic energy of the party seemed to emanate from table 12, where his daughter's innocent charm and Elise's natural warmth had created a magnetic center of genuine human connection. Grace had awakened from her brief nap and was now entertaining their table mates with elaborate theories about why wedding cake was different from birthday cake, while Maya showed a tech executive's wife the proper technique for drawing horses. The adults at their table appeared more engaged and animated than most of the carefully networked conversations happening elsewhere. Watching this scene while surrounded by the fruits of his ambition, the estate, the impressive guest list, the bride who represented his social arrival, Marcus felt that hidden wedding ring calling to him across the miles between his current location and his home office. That simple gold band represented promises he had made to a different version of himself, commitments to values he had gradually abandoned in pursuit of external validation and material success. The man who had worn that ring would have been horrified by Richard Sterling's patronizing toast, would have stood up and defended both his background and his worth. But that man had also understood that worth was measured in love given and received, in presence during important moments, in the daily choice to prioritize relationships over achievements. As dessert was served and the evening moved toward its conclusion, Marcus realized that the hidden wedding ring in his desk drawer wasn't just a relic of his past, it was evidence of the man he could still choose to become if he found the courage to reclaim the values it represented. As the formal dinner concluded and guests began to mingle freely again, Marcus found himself drawn inexorably toward table 12. The evening's revelations about Elise's professional accomplishments, her natural grace under social pressure, and her obvious devotion to their daughters had created a gravitational pull he could no longer resist. Victoria was engaged in conversation with several of her bridesmaids, giving him a window of opportunity to approach his family without causing immediate marital friction. Maya had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her small body relaxed in the trusting way children could achieve anywhere when they felt safe. Grace was still awake but drowsy, playing absently with a small toy she had brought in her backpack. The sight of his daughters in their mother's care struck Marcus with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, but a profound sense of exclusion from something precious. "They're tired," he said quietly as he approached, not wanting to wake Maya. "It's past their bedtime," Elise replied, automatically adjusting her position to better support their sleeping daughter. "But they wanted to stay to see you get married. Maya especially. She's been talking about it for weeks." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Marcus was only beginning to process. His daughters had been anticipating his wedding, discussing it, making plans to attend, despite not being formally included in the ceremony. They had wanted to witness this milestone in his life, had asked their mother to bring them, had made him a card to celebrate an event that officially excluded them from his future family structure. "I should probably get them home soon," Elise continued, glancing at her watch. "It's already 2 hours past their usual bedtime, and Maya gets cranky when she doesn't get enough sleep." Something in the way Elise said Maya's name, with a protective emphasis that suggested more than typical parental concern, caught Marcus's attention. He looked more closely at his older daughter, noticing for the first time details that his initial shock at seeing her had obscured. Maya looked thinner than he remembered, her face more angular despite the softness of sleep. There was something else too, A small plastic hospital bracelet around her wrist, the kind they gave to pediatric patients but forgot to remove after discharge. "What's that?" Marcus asked, nodding toward Maya's wrist. Elise followed his gaze and her expression shifted, subtly becoming more guarded. "It's nothing, just she likes to wear it. You know how kids get attached to things." But Marcus had spent years reading people in business negotiations, recognizing when someone was deflecting or withholding information. Elise's casual dismissal of the bracelet didn't match the careful way she positioned Maya's arm to hide it, or the slight tension that had entered her voice. "Elise," he said more firmly, "what happened? Why is Maya wearing a hospital bracelet?" For a long moment, Elise didn't respond. Around them, the reception continued with its background soundtrack of laughter and conversation, but Marcus felt as though they were enclosed in a bubble of sudden silence. When Elise finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 4 months ago. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, so unexpected and devastating that he actually stepped backward. Leukemia. Cancer. His 5-year-old daughter had been fighting cancer, and he hadn't known. "What?" The word came out strangled, disbelieving. "She's in remission now," Elise continued quickly, seeing the shock on his face. "The treatment was successful. The doctors are optimistic about her long-term prognosis. She's doing well, Marcus. She's going to be fine." But Marcus barely heard the reassurances. His mind was reeling, trying to process the magnitude of what Elise was telling him. 4 months ago would have been January. What had he been doing in January? He remembered closing a major software licensing deal with a European consortium, remembered the celebration dinner his team had thrown to mark the company's best quarterly performance ever. While he had been celebrating financial victories, his daughter had been undergoing cancer treatment. 4 months, he repeated numbly. "She's been sick for 4 months, and you didn't tell me?" "I tried to tell you," Elise said, her voice gaining strength. "I called your office in January when we first got the diagnosis. Your assistant said you were in meetings all day and would call me back. You didn't." Marcus felt his stomach drop as memories began surfacing. He vaguely remembered his assistant mentioning calls from Elise, but they had come during a particularly intense period of acquisition negotiations. He had assumed they were about custody schedule changes or school events, routine co-parenting, logistics that could wait until he had time to deal with them properly. "I called again the next day," Elise continued, "and the day after that. Finally, your assistant told me you were traveling and suggested I email you with whatever I needed to discuss. So I did. I never got—" Marcus began, but stopped as he realized the truth. He had probably received the emails, but hadn't read them carefully, skimming past anything that looked like personal correspondence while focusing on business communications. Or worse, his assistant might have filtered them into a folder for non-urgent messages that he rarely checked. "Maya had to start chemotherapy immediately," Elise said, her voice steady, but her eyes showing the strain of reliving those terrifying weeks. "I had to take a leave of absence from teaching to be with her during treatments. She was so scared, Marcus. She kept asking why Daddy wasn't coming to see her at the hospital." Each word was like a dagger, revealing the depth of his failure, not just as a father, but as a human being. While he had been building his fortune, measuring his success in stock valuations and industry recognition, his daughter had been fighting for her life and wondering why her father didn't care enough to visit her. "The treatments were expensive," Elise continued, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded piece of paper. It was a hospital discharge summary dated 3 weeks ago, with Maya's name at the top and a long list of medical procedures and medications documented below. Insurance covered most of it, but there were co-pays, travel expenses, medications that weren't fully covered. I used my savings, took out a loan against my retirement account. Marcus looked at the medical papers with growing horror, not just at the clinical details of his daughter's treatment, but at the financial burden Elise had shouldered alone. The amounts listed represented what he might spend on a weekend entertainment budget, but for Elise, on a teacher's salary, they would have been crushing. "Why didn't you—" He started to ask why she hadn't contacted him about the money, then stopped as he realized how absurd the question was. She had tried to contact him about their daughter's cancer diagnosis. If he couldn't be reached for news that their child was fighting for her life, why would she bother calling about the financial details? "I handled it," Elise said simply. "Maya is healthy now. That's what matters." But Marcus could see the cost of handling it in the lines around Elise's eyes, in the careful way she calculated every expense, in the modest dress she wore to his extravagant wedding. While he had been accumulating wealth beyond his ability to spend it, the mother of his children had been bankrupting herself to save their daughter's life. "She's really okay?" he asked, looking down at Maya's sleeping face with new eyes. Now he could see what he had missed before, the slight thinness that suggested recent weight loss, the pallor that came from months spent indoors receiving treatment, the faint shadows under her eyes that spoke of a battle fought and won. "She's really okay," Elise confirmed. "The doctors say her response to treatment was excellent. She'll need regular checkups for the next few years, but her prognosis is very good." Grace, who had been quietly listening to this conversation while pretending to play with her toy, suddenly spoke up. "Maya was very brave at the hospital," she said solemnly. "She only cried sometimes. And I brought her cookies from school." The innocence of Grace's contribution to the conversation, her matter-of-fact acceptance of her sister's illness and her own small efforts to help, highlighted the magnitude of what Marcus had missed. His daughters had faced this crisis together, supporting each other, while their father remained obliviously focused on business deals and social climbing. "I should have been there," Marcus said, the words inadequate to express the full scope of his regret. "Yes," Elise agreed quietly. "You should have been." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just a simple acknowledgement of reality that was somehow more devastating than any recrimination could have been. She wasn't trying to make him feel guilty. She was just stating the truth about his absence during the most frightening period of their daughter's young life. As if sensing the gravity of the conversation happening above her, Maya stirred in her mother's arms, opening her eyes sleepily. When she saw Marcus, she smiled with the uncomplicated joy children could summon even after enduring experiences that would break most adults. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly. "Did you like our card?" "I loved your card," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't contain. "It's the best present anyone has ever given me." Maya beamed and settled back against her mother's shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had pleased her father. The simple exchange broke something inside Marcus's chest, a protective barrier he had constructed around his heart to justify his choices and protect himself from the consequences of his emotional absence. Looking at his daughter, this brave, resilient child who had fought cancer while he ignored her mother's calls, Marcus realized that all his success meant nothing if it came at the cost of missing the moments that truly mattered. The wealth, the status, the marriage to Victoria, none of it could compensate for the fact that he hadn't been there when his daughter needed him most. And worse, if Elise hadn't told him tonight, he might never have known about Maya's illness at all. He would have continued his life of calculated achievement and social positioning, oblivious to the real drama unfolding in the lives of the people who should have mattered most to him. The revelation about Maya's illness hit Marcus like a seismic shift, reordering everything he thought he understood about his life and priorities. After learning that his daughter had fought cancer while he remained unreachable, focused on business deals that now seemed utterly meaningless, Marcus felt a desperate need to escape the suffocating weight of his own failures. He excused himself from the reception with mumbled apologies about needing to handle urgent business, a lie that felt particularly hollow given how his obsession with work had caused him to miss the most important crisis in his daughter's young life. Victoria called after him, but he pretended not to hear as he strode across the estate toward the house, his chest tight with emotions he didn't know how to process. Marcus's study provided the sanctuary he needed, its familiar surroundings usually offering comfort and control. Tonight, however, the room felt like a monument to misplaced priorities. The walls displayed his achievements, framed articles about Caldwell technologies, awards from industry organizations, photographs of him with politicians and celebrities. But now these symbols of success seemed to mock him. He sank into his leather chair and pulled Maya's hospital bracelet from his pocket, where he had slipped it when she wasn't looking. The small piece of plastic was worn smooth from her wearing it. The printed information nearly faded. Maya Caldwell, it read, along with dates that chronicled weeks of treatment at Oakland Children's Hospital. The bracelet was so small, designed for a 5-year-old's wrist, yet it represented struggles that most adults would find unbearable. Maya had kept the bracelet as a reminder, or perhaps as a talisman, evidence of her own bravery during the darkest period of her young life. That she had worn it to his wedding suggested she still thought about her illness, still carried the memory of that frightening time when she had needed her father most, and he had been nowhere to be found. Marcus's phone sat silent on his desk, a stark contrast to its usual constant buzzing with calls and messages that had once seemed so important. The Singapore deal that had interrupted his conversation with Elise earlier in the evening now felt like a cruel joke. He had prioritized a business negotiation over reconnecting with his daughter, who had survived cancer without his knowledge or support. The door to his study opened without a knock, and Victoria entered with the determined stride of someone who had reached the end of her patience. She was still beautiful in her wedding gown, still every inch the perfect society bride, but her composure was beginning to crack around the edges. "What is going on, Marcus?" she demanded, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. "You disappear from our wedding reception to have long conversations with your ex-wife, then you vanish entirely to hide in your office. Our guests are asking questions I don't know how to answer." Marcus looked up at his new wife, a woman he had married for all the wrong reasons, he was beginning to realize, and felt the full weight of the emotional gulf between them. How could he explain that his daughter had been fighting for her life, while he celebrated quarterly earnings reports? How could he make Victoria understand that the handmade card from his twins meant more to him than all the expensive wedding gifts combined? Maya was sick, he said simply. She had leukemia. I didn't know. Victoria's expression shifted from anger to confusion, to something that might have been sympathy, though it was difficult to tell, with someone who had been trained from childhood to maintain social facades. "That's terrible," she said carefully. "But Marcus, that was in the past. She's better now, right? You can't let guilt about something you couldn't control ruin our wedding day." "I could have controlled it," Marcus replied, his voice hollow. "I could have answered Elise's calls. I could have read her emails. I could have been there for my daughter instead of chasing deals that don't matter." "Of course they matter," Victoria said, moving closer to his desk. "Your work is important. Caldwell Technologies employs thousands of people. You can't be expected to drop everything every time there's a family crisis." The phrase family crisis hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental difference in how they viewed his relationship with Maya and Grace. To Victoria, his daughters were remnants of his past, complications to be managed rather than central features of his identity. To Marcus, increasingly, they were the most important relationships he had ever had and ever would have. "She's 5 years old," Marcus said, holding up Maya's hospital bracelet. "She's 5 years old, and she fought cancer while I was in board meetings. What kind of father does that make me?" "It makes you human," Victoria replied, but her tone suggested she was reciting something she thought she should say, rather than expressing genuine understanding. "You didn't know. You can't blame yourself for not being psychic." But Marcus could blame himself, and he did. He could blame himself for training his staff to filter personal calls, for treating his family as a lower priority than his business interests, for assuming that success in one area of life could compensate for failure in another. Before Victoria could continue her attempts at reassurance, the study door opened again. This time it was Dorothy Caldwell, Marcus's mother, and her expression suggested she had not come to offer comfort. "Victoria, dear, would you mind giving me a moment alone with my son?" Dorothy's voice was polite but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had raised Marcus and retained the right to speak plainly to him, regardless of his wealth or social status. Victoria hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Marcus alone in his current emotional state, but social conditioning prevailed. "Of course," she said, though her smile was strained. "I'll be with our guests." After Victoria left, Dorothy closed the door and turned to face her son with an expression that transported Marcus back to his childhood, when his mother's disappointment was the worst punishment he could imagine. "I just spent 20 minutes with my granddaughters," Dorothy said without preamble. "Do you know what Grace told me? She told me that when Maya was in the hospital, she prayed every night that Daddy would come visit. She drew pictures of our whole family together and taped them to Maya's hospital bed so Maya could see them during treatments." Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in years. But Dorothy wasn't finished. "Maya told me about the day. The doctors said she was getting better. She said the first thing she wanted to do was call Daddy to tell him the good news. But Mommy said Daddy was too busy with important work things. So instead, they made you a card. Do you know what that card said, Marcus?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice. "It said, 'Thank you for making me better, doctors. I can't wait to see Daddy again soon.' She gave it to her oncologist instead of sending it to you, because even a 5-year-old could understand that you weren't available for the most important moment of her life." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one highlighting another layer of his failure. His daughters had coped with the crisis without him, had found ways to include him in their hopes and prayers despite his absence, had continued to love him even when he proved himself unworthy of that love. "I didn't know," Marcus said weakly. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Dorothy replied sharply. "You turned yourself into someone who couldn't be reached by his own family because being unreachable made you feel important. You convinced yourself that making money was more meaningful than making memories." Marcus looked around his study, at the awards, the expensive furniture, the symbols of his professional success, and realized his mother was absolutely right. He had built an elaborate fortress around himself, protecting his time and attention from anything that might interfere with his pursuit of wealth and status. The fortress had been so effective that his own daughter's life-threatening illness couldn't penetrate it. "When you sent that invitation to Elise," Dorothy continued, "what did you think would happen? Did you really believe she would stay away? Or were you hoping she would come and remind you of who you used to be?" The question stopped Marcus cold because it touched on something he hadn't consciously acknowledged. Why had he invited Elise to his wedding? The surface explanation, magnanimous gesture, proof of his evolved perspective, now seemed laughably shallow. Had some part of him known that seeing Elise and his daughters would force him to confront the choices he had made? Had he subconsciously orchestrated this moment of reckoning? "I think," Dorothy said more gently, seeing the recognition in her son's eyes, "that you invited her because you knew this marriage was a mistake. You knew Victoria represents everything you thought you wanted, rather than everything you actually need. And you hoped that seeing your real family would give you the courage to admit it." Marcus stared at Maya's hospital bracelet, this small piece of plastic that represented so much: his daughter's courage, her mother's strength, his own devastating absence from the moments that mattered most. Outside his study window, he could see the wedding reception continuing without him, his guests celebrating a union that felt increasingly hollow with each passing minute. The choice before him was stark and simple, though not easy. He could return, to the reception, smile for the photographers, and continue building a life based on social expectations and material success. He could treat tonight's revelations as a temporary emotional disruption, something to be managed and contained rather than acted upon. Or he could acknowledge that the invitation to Elise had been exactly what his mother suggested, a subconscious cry for redemption, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the parts of himself he had sacrificed in pursuit of conventional success. He could admit that Maya's hospital bracelet mattered more than all his business achievements combined, that being a present father was more important than being a successful entrepreneur. The decision would determine not just the course of his marriage to Victoria, but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. As he sat in his study, surrounded by the monuments to his professional success, Marcus realized that everything truly important was happening outside, where his daughters were falling asleep in their mother's arms, where his real life was waiting for him to finally show up. Marcus burst from his study with sudden clarity, Maya's hospital bracelet clutched in his hand like a compass pointing toward what truly mattered. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see Elise gathering her purse and gently rousing the twins from their sleepy contentment. The sight filled him with panic. They were leaving, and if he let them go now, he might never find the courage to face the truth about his failures again. He ran through the house and out onto the estate grounds, his formal wedding shoes slipping slightly on the manicured grass. The reception was still in full swing behind him, the string quartet providing elegant background music for conversations that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the scene unfolding near the valet parking area. Elise was carefully buckling Maya into a car seat in her modest Honda sedan, a vehicle that looked almost absurd next to the Maseratis and Teslas that dominated the guest parking area. Grace was already secured in her booster seat, clutching a small stuffed animal and looking drowsy but content. The contrast between their simple family scene and the ostentatious wealth surrounding them struck Marcus with painful clarity. "Wait!" he called out, his voice carrying more desperation than he intended. "Please wait!" Elise turned from the car, surprise flickering across her face. Several other guests who were retrieving their own vehicles paused to watch the unexpected drama unfolding before them. Marcus realized he was creating exactly the kind of scene that would fuel society gossip for months. But for once in his adult life, he didn't care about appearances or social consequences. "You're leaving," he said when he reached them, the words sounding foolish even to his own ears. "It's late," Elise replied carefully, clearly unsure why the groom at his own wedding was chasing after his ex-wife in the parking area. "The girls need to get home." Marcus looked at his daughters through the car windows, Maya fighting sleep but still aware enough to wave at him, Grace already dozing against her stuffed animal. These were his children, his flesh and blood, and he barely knew them. He couldn't remember the last book Maya had read or what Grace's favorite subject in school was. He didn't know if they had fears about starting kindergarten or dreams about what they wanted to be when they grew up. "Maya," he said, approaching the car window where his older daughter sat. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Maya nodded solemnly as Marcus knelt beside the car, bringing himself to her eye level. Her hospital bracelet was gone from her wrist. He still had it in his pocket, but now he could see other signs of her recent ordeal. A small scar near her collarbone where a port had been placed for chemotherapy. The way she held herself with a carefulness that suggested she had learned to be protective of her body. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were sick," he said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to maintain composure. "I should have been there. I should have held your hand during the scary parts and read you stories when you couldn't sleep." Maya tilted her head with the serious consideration children brought to important conversations. "It's okay, Daddy. Mummy said you were working really hard to take care of other people." The generous interpretation of his absence, clearly Elise's attempt to preserve his daughter's faith in him despite his failures, made Marcus's guilt even more unbearable. Even when he had abandoned them, In their hour of greatest need, Elise had protected his relationship with his children, had found ways to excuse his absence that preserved their ability to love him. "Working isn't more important than taking care of you," Marcus said, the admission feeling like a confession that went to the core of everything he had believed about success and responsibility. "You and Grace are the most important things in my whole life, and I forgot that. I'm sorry." More guests had gathered to watch the scene, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern to barely concealed fascination with the real-life drama playing out before them. Marcus was dimly aware that his public breakdown would be the subject of speculation and gossip for years to come, but the awareness felt distant and unimportant. "Marcus." Victoria's voice cut through the evening air with crystalline precision. She had followed him from the house, and now stood a few feet away, her wedding gown pristine and her composure intact, despite the circumstances. "What are you doing?" He turned to face his bride, his wife of less than 6 hours, and saw in her expression a calculation he had missed before. Victoria wasn't concerned about his emotional state or the pain he was experiencing as he confronted his failures as a father. She was concerned about the spectacle, about what this scene would do to their social standing, about how his public display of emotion might affect their carefully constructed image. "I'm talking to my daughters," Marcus said simply. "At our wedding reception," Victoria replied, her smile bright, but her tone sharp with warning. "In front of our guests. Don't you think this conversation could wait until a more appropriate time?" The suggestion that there was an appropriate time to apologize to his children for missing their medical crisis, that his emotional breakdown should be scheduled around social conveniences, crystallized everything that was wrong with the life he had built. Victoria wasn't evil or cruel. She was simply a product of a world that valued appearance over authenticity, status over substance, convenience over truth. "No," Marcus said, surprising himself with the firmness of his response. "This can't wait. Nothing is more important than this." He pulled his car keys from his pocket, the keys to his Lamborghini, a vehicle that cost more than most people's houses, but couldn't transport him to the places that actually mattered. As he spoke, the keys slipped from his trembling fingers and fell onto the asphalt with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The sound of his expensive car keys hitting the ground felt symbolic, a physical representation of his willingness to abandon the material symbols of success that had replaced human connection in his life. He didn't bend to pick them up. "Victoria," he said, turning to face her fully, "I can't do this. This wedding, this marriage, this life we've planned, I can't do it." The words hung in the night air like a revelation that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Around them, the witnesses to this destruction of a society wedding stood frozen, unsure whether they were observing a temporary breakdown or a permanent transformation. Victoria's composure finally cracked, her perfect smile disappearing as the implications of his words became clear. "You're having a moment," she said quickly. "It's normal for grooms to feel overwhelmed. Let's just go inside, finish the reception, and talk about this tomorrow when you're thinking more clearly." But Marcus was thinking more clearly than he had in years, and the clarity was painful and liberating in equal measure. He looked at his daughters, watching through the car windows, at Elise standing beside the vehicle with careful neutrality, at Victoria, whose primary concern remained social appearances, and he finally understood what he had to do. Marcus looked at Victoria's expectant face, then at his daughters watching through the car window, and felt the moment crystallize into perfect clarity. The choice before him wasn't complicated. It was simply difficult. He could continue living the life he had constructed based on external expectations and material achievements, or he could choose the messier, more vulnerable path of authentic connection with the people who actually mattered. Without breaking eye contact with Victoria, Marcus reached for his wedding ring, the platinum band they had selected together from an exclusive jeweler, a symbol of their union and his arrival in her social sphere. He pulled it from his finger with deliberate slowness, the metal sliding over his knuckle with surprising ease. "I'm sorry," he said to Victoria, holding the ring between them. "I'm sorry for what this will do to you, for the embarrassment, for the questions you'll have to answer, but I can't pretend anymore that this is what either of us really wants." Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally a kind of cold calculation that suggested she was already considering damage control strategies. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low but carrying to the gathered observers. "You're throwing away everything we've built together. For what? A moment of guilt about your ex-wife?" "I'm choosing my children," Marcus replied simply. "I should have chosen them a long time ago." The gathered guests watched in fascination as Marcus approached Elise's car, the wedding ring still in his hand. He knocked gently on Maya's window, and she rolled it down with the electric switch, her young face serious as she sensed the gravity of the adult drama unfolding around her. "Maya, honey," Marcus said, kneeling beside the car so he was at her eye level, "I want you to have this back." He pulled her hospital bracelet from his pocket and gently fastened it around her wrist where it belonged. The small plastic band looked right there, a reminder of her strength and courage rather than a symbol of his absence. "Thank you, Daddy," Maya said solemnly. Then, in the way children could shift emotional gears with startling speed, she brightened. "Look what I made for you today." She reached into a small bag beside her seat and pulled out a broken red crayon, its wrapper torn and its tip worn down to a stub from heavy use. "I was going to draw you a picture of your new house, but I ran out of red for the roof. Grace said you probably have lots of new crayons here, but I wanted to give you my favorite one." The gesture, a child offering her father her most treasured art supply, even though it was broken and nearly used up, struck Marcus with overwhelming emotion. Here was love without condition, generosity without calculation, a gift given simply, because she wanted to share something precious with someone important to her. "It's perfect," Marcus said, accepting the broken crayon as if it were made of gold. "It's the most perfect present anyone has ever given me." Grace, not to be outdone by her sister, leaned across the car to hand him a small piece of paper she had been clutching. It was a drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands, 2 tall, 2 small, standing under a rainbow with "My Family" written in crooked letters across the top. "I made this during dinner," Grace announced proudly. The lady with the pretty dress said, "Families are the most important thing, so I drew ours." Marcus looked at the drawing, at the simple representation of connection and belonging that his 5-year-old daughter understood better than he had in years of pursuing success, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The stick figures weren't glamorous or impressive, but they were complete in a way his actual life had never been. "Thank you, Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is exactly what I needed to see." He stood and faced Elise, who had been watching this interaction with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was wariness there and caution, but also something that might have been hope. "I know I don't deserve it," Marcus said to her, his voice carrying to the assembled guests who hung on every word of this real-life drama. "I know I've been absent and selfish and completely wrong about what matters, but I want to try to be the father they deserve. I want to be present for them in ways I never was before." Elise studied his face for a long moment, clearly weighing his words against years of disappointment and broken promises. "This isn't about us," she said finally. "This is about Maya and Grace. They need consistency, Marcus. They need someone who shows up not just for the big moments, but for the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when nothing special is happening." "I understand," Marcus replied. "I want to show up for all of it, the ordinary and the extraordinary." "We'll see," Elise said, but her tone suggested she might be willing to give him a chance to prove his commitment. "You can start by coming to Maya's follow-up appointment next week. It's at 2 o'clock on Thursday at Oakland Children's Hospital." The mention of the hospital where his daughter had received treatment without his knowledge sent another wave of guilt through Marcus. But he nodded gratefully. "I'll be there." Behind him, Victoria's voice cut through the evening air with Arctic precision. "This is ridiculous, Marcus. You're having an emotional breakdown, and you're making decisions that will ruin both our lives. Come inside, apologize to our guests, and we can discuss this privately." Marcus turned to face his bride one last time, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since they had begun dating. Victoria was beautiful, intelligent, and perfectly suited for the life he had thought he wanted. But she was also someone who viewed his children as complications to be managed rather than blessings to be cherished, someone who prioritized social appearances over emotional truth. "I'm sorry, Victoria," he said, meaning it completely. "You deserve someone who can be the husband you need, but that person isn't me. Not anymore." Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. "Fine," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that carried across the estate grounds. "But don't expect me to wait around while you work through your midlife crisis. And don't expect my family to pretend this humiliation never happened." She turned on her heel and stalked back toward the house, her wedding gown trailing behind her like a symbol of dreams abandoned. Several guests followed her, drawn by the promise of witnessing more drama or perhaps offering comfort to the abandoned bride. Others remained in the parking area, watching as Marcus knelt beside his daughter's car one more time, committing to a future that was uncertain but real in ways his previous life had never been. 6 months later, Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor of Elise's modest Oakland apartment, surrounded by art supplies and the focused concentration of 2 6-year-old girls working on their latest masterpiece. Maya was carefully outlining a house with her favorite purple crayon. She had insisted on purple roofs for all her buildings since that evening at the wedding when Marcus told her purple suns would be beautiful too. Grace was adding what appeared to be a jungle gym to the backyard, complete with stick figures that could have been children or possibly small aliens, depending on one's interpretation. "What do you think, Daddy?" Maya asked, holding up her paper for his inspection. "Should the flowers be pink or yellow? What do you think they should be?" Marcus replied, a response he had learned in family therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Reyes, a warm woman who specialized in helping divorced parents rebuild relationships with their children. The simple technique of turning questions back to his daughters, of honoring their creative instincts rather than imposing his own preferences, had been revolutionary in their growing connection. "Both," Maya decided pragmatically. "Real gardens have lots of different colors." Marcus smiled, remembering how he used to approach such decisions with business-like efficiency, always looking for the single correct answer rather than embracing the possibility that multiple solutions could coexist. Dr. Reyes had helped him understand that fatherhood required a different kind of intelligence, one that valued curiosity over certainty, presence over productivity. The weekly therapy sessions had been difficult at first, forcing Marcus to confront patterns of behavior he had developed over years of prioritizing work over relationships. He had learned about emotional availability, about the difference between quality time and simply being in the same physical space, about how children experience love through consistent presence rather than expensive gifts. More challenging had been the individual therapy sessions where Dr. Reyes helped him examine the deeper motivations behind his relentless pursuit of success. Growing up with financial insecurity had driven him to accumulate wealth as a form of protection, but somewhere along the way, the means had become the end, and he had lost sight of what he was actually trying to protect. "Mr. Marcus," Grace interrupted. "His thoughts. Can you help me draw a butterfly? Mine looks like a blob." Marcus carefully took the crayon from her small hand and demonstrated how to create symmetrical wings, then handed it back so she could finish the drawing herself. These small moments of artistic collaboration had become precious to him, more meaningful than any business achievement, more satisfying than any social recognition he had ever received. The transformation hadn't been easy. The wedding scandal had indeed dominated society pages for weeks, with varying accounts of his public breakdown and abandonment of Victoria Sterling at the altar. Some reports painted him as a man having a midlife crisis. Others suggested he had been overwhelmed by family pressures. The truth, as usual, was more complex than any simple narrative could capture. Victoria had recovered quickly from their dissolved marriage, announcing her engagement to a banking heir from her social circle within 3 months. The speed of her rebound suggested that their connection had been more strategic than romantic, a realization that validated Marcus's decision while also making him feel slightly foolish about his own romantic calculations. Professionally, the dramatic end, too. His marriage had surprisingly little impact on Caldwell Technologies. If anything, his newfound commitment to work-life balance had improved his leadership, making him more thoughtful in his decision-making and more empathetic in his management style. The Singapore deal he had been so worried about on his wedding day had eventually closed successfully, proving that most business crises were less urgent than they appeared when viewed through the lens of actual priority. The biggest change was in his relationship with his daughters. What had started as awkward scheduled visits had gradually evolved into natural, integrated time together. He picked them up from school on Wednesdays, attended Maya's art exhibitions at the community center, and never missed Grace's soccer games, even when they conflicted with board meetings. Maya's 6-month cancer screening appointment had been clear, the news they had all hoped for but hadn't dared to assume. Marcus had been there for the appointment, holding her hand during the blood draw and celebrating with ice cream afterward when the results confirmed her continued remission. The relief he felt hearing those results had been more intense than any business victory he had ever experienced. "Look, Daddy." Grace held up her completed butterfly, its wings now properly symmetrical and decorated with intricate patterns. "It's beautiful, just like the ones in your garden." "It's perfect," Marcus agreed, meaning it completely. He had sold the Malibu estate and moved into a smaller but more comfortable house in the Berkeley Hills, close enough to Oakland that his daughters could visit easily. The new house had a garden where Grace could study insects and Maya could paint outdoors, spaces designed for family life rather than entertaining business associates. Elise appeared in the doorway of the living room, carrying a tray with juice boxes and cut fruit. She moved with the same quiet grace Marcus remembered from their marriage, but there was a confidence in her bearing now that spoke to the independence she had developed during their years apart. Their relationship remained carefully defined, co-parents rather than romantic partners, though Marcus sometimes caught glimpses of the woman he had fallen in love with in college. They attended school events together, coordinated birthday celebrations, and had even begun family dinners on Sunday evenings. The possibility of something more hung unspoken between them, but Marcus was learning to value patience over pursuit, to let relationships develop naturally rather than forcing them toward predetermined outcomes. "How's the masterpiece coming along?" Elise asked, settling beside them on the floor with the easy comfort of someone accustomed to child-centered activities. "We're making a family picture," Maya announced. "See? That's our house. And that's Daddy's new house. And this is the park where we have picnics." Marcus looked at the drawing. 4 stick figures holding hands in front of various buildings and natural settings, connected by rainbow bridges and surrounded by purple flowers and asymmetrical butterflies. It was more complex than the simple family drawings Maya had made during his wedding, showing a deeper understanding of how relationships could exist across different spaces while remaining fundamentally connected. "It's beautiful," Elise said, and Marcus heard genuine emotion in her voice. "Should we hang it on the refrigerator with the others?" As they gathered the art supplies and prepared to move to the kitchen, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that evening when he had learned the most important lesson of his adult life. Sometimes the people we've left behind do carry the most important pieces of our hearts, and sometimes, if we're very lucky and very determined, we get the chance to reclaim those pieces and discover that love, unlike success, only grows when it's shared. The refrigerator in Elise's kitchen was covered with drawings, report cards, photographs, and other artifacts of their children's lives, a gallery that had grown substantially since Marcus became a consistent presence in their daily world. As Maya carefully taped her new drawing among the others, Marcus saw it for what it was. Evidence of a family rebuilt on stronger foundations, one that valued presence over presence, connection over status, and the simple joy of purple suns and crooked butterflies over any measure of conventional success. Outside the kitchen window, the California sun was setting over Oakland, casting the neighborhood in golden light that reminded Marcus of another sunset 6 months ago, when he had stood at his estate and realized that everything he thought he wanted was nothing compared to what he actually needed. Now surrounded by the laughter of his daughters and the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt around love rather than achievement, he understood that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with moments like these. Ordinary Tuesday evenings that were extraordinary in their simple authenticity.